No one wanted that dying horse, until it led a broken man to a silver fortune, buried by ghosts. The auction yard was almost empty when Caleb Rowan spent his last $3 on a horse everyone else believed was worthless. Its ribs showed, its eyes were hollow, and men laughed when he led it away. But that night, under the cold Montana sky, the animal lifted its head toward the distant hills, as if it remembered where a fortune was buried. The morning light came thin and sharp over the plains of Montana, slicing through the chill of early autumn. The air smelled of dust and dry hay, and the sound of restless horses mixed with the low hum of men bargaining for a living. Caleb Rowan stood at the edge of the crowd, shoulders slightly hunched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat. Inside, he could feel the cool weight of 3 silver coins, all that was left of the life he once had. The auction yard was a place for the hopeful and the desperate. He used to be both. Once, he had a small forge in Red Willow, where he made wagon shoes and horseshoes and sometimes wedding rings for young couples with bright eyes. That was before the fire, before the sparks from his own anvil set the thatched roof ablaze, before smoke took his wife's breath and the heat stole his son's small voice. Since then, every clang of metal reminded him of what he'd lost. He hadn't spoken much since. People said he'd gone half mad, still walking around the burned lot at dusk, as if listening for footsteps that weren't there. Now, with winter coming, and the frost already painting the edges of his boots white each morning, Caleb had come here for one last try, to find a horse strong enough to plow the few acres left behind the ruin he still called home. One after another, the auctioneer shouted out numbers that meant nothing to him. $20, $35, $42, prices that belonged to men who still believed in seasons. The animals were sleek, shining under the sun, their manes brushed and braided. Caleb stood silent, waiting for something he couldn't name. Then the noise around him shifted. Men laughed, the cruel kind of laughter that fills empty bellies. The auctioneer waved a lazy hand toward the far corner of the pen. "Next up, this one's been through hell," he said. "Used hard and left worse. You'd be doing me a favor taking him off my hands." The crowd parted a little, and Caleb saw it, a horse so thin he could count every rib from where he stood. Its coat was gray, dulled by dirt and neglect, its flanks marked by old scars. The animal didn't move, didn't look up. It just stood there, head hanging low, as if waiting for the earth itself to swallow it whole. $5, the auctioneer called. Silence. 4? Still nothing but shifting boots and dry laughter. 3, then. Come on, folks. It's cheaper than feeding a dog. Caleb's hand moved before his mind did. Raised it, voice rough from disuse. 3. The crowd turned. A few snorted. One man muttered, "Fools throwing good money after ghosts." The auctioneer blinked, shrugged, and banged the gavel. "Sold to the gentleman in the torn coat. May the Lord bless his optimism." As the others moved on, Caleb walked toward the pen. The closer he came, the more he noticed the details, the cracked hooves, the torn left ear, the dullness of its eyes. But when he reached for the rope, the horse finally looked up. Just once. And in that single look, Caleb saw something that made him stop breathing. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of quiet knowing. He placed his hand on the horse's neck. The skin was warm, trembling slightly under his touch. "You and me," he whispered. "We're both used up." He named the horse Ashen, because everything worth remembering in his life had turned to ash. They walked out of the yard together, slow and awkward, as if both were learning how to move again. Dust rose around their boots and hooves, catching the sunlight in faint silver glints. As they reached the dirt road that led east toward Red Willow, the wind shifted. It carried the faint scent of rain and iron, the kind of smell that lingered around mines and mountain storms. Caleb tightened his grip on the rope. "Home's that way," he said softly. But Ashen stopped, muscles stiffening, and turned his head toward the far-off ridges of the Silver Crest Hills, gray against the horizon like a sleeping beast. Caleb followed the horse's gaze for a long moment. "Nothing there but ghosts," he muttered, tugging the rope. Ashen didn't move. The two stood locked in silence as the wind swept through the dry grass around them. Then, with a quiet sigh, Caleb gave the rope another pull. "Come on, partner," he said. "Let's start over. Maybe this time the fire won't find us." They began to walk again, one step at a time, leaving behind the laughter of the yard. Neither of them looked back. The wind that carried them home felt colder than it should have for early autumn. Dust rolled in waves across the long road to Red Willow, coating the man and horse alike in a thin film of earth. Caleb walked with his head down, boots scuffing the dirt. Beside him, Ashen moved like a shadow stitched to his side, quiet, reluctant, half there. Every few steps the horse would slow, tug gently at the rope, and turn his blind gaze toward the Silver Crest Hills that loomed in the distance. "Easy now," Caleb murmured. His voice came out hoarse, as if unused to kindness. "There's feed and water waitin' back home." But Ashen didn't care for water or rest. The horse's ribs rose and fell like bellows, its ears flicking at some sound only it could hear. Twice, it stopped outright, hooves planted, neck stretched toward the gray horizon. Caleb followed its stare and saw nothing but the shimmer of heat over dry grass. Still, something about that stillness, the focused yearning in the animal's stance, made his heart tighten. They reached his land by sunset. What remained of the forge stood black against the orange sky, a collapsed roof, the twisted mouth of the chimney, a scatter of iron tools half buried in ash. Caleb led Ashen to the small lean-to that had once been his stable. The boards creaked. The air inside smelled of smoke and rust, but it was shelter. He poured a bucket of well water into a trough and scattered a few handfuls of grain, the last of what he had. Ashen lowered his head to drink, but only for a moment. Then the horse turned away from the trough and walked to the far wall, facing the hills again. The movement was so deliberate, so strangely human, that Caleb stopped mid-step. He watched until darkness filled the barn. When he finally lit the old lantern, its glow carved the shape of the horse against the boards, a narrow back, a bowed neck, an animal carved out of sorrow and stubbornness. That night, Caleb lay on the floor near the doorway. He could hear Ashen shifting his weight, the occasional soft snort, the scrape of hoof against dirt. The sounds mixed with the whisper of wind through the broken roof. Somewhere between waking and dream, he thought he heard another sound, a faint metallic clink, like a hammer striking stone far away. He sat up, listening. Only silence answered. In the morning, a fog rolled in from the lowlands, ghosting through the burned skeleton of the forge. Caleb worked quietly, patching leaks in the roof, his hands raw from cold nails. Each strike of the hammer echoed in the empty air, a rhythm that reminded him of what used to be, the ring of metal. His wife's laughter drifting from the kitchen window, the scent of baking bread. He paused, letting the memories fade back into the fog. When he turned, Ashen was watching him through a crack in the barn door, one dark eye gleaming in the pale light. "You're a strange one," Caleb said softly. "Can't tell if you're remembering something or warning me about it." Ashen blinked slowly, then shifted his weight. His coat caught the light for the first time, showing faint marks that looked like burns, or maybe brands long since healed over. Caleb stepped closer, brushing the dust aside with careful fingers. Beneath the grime lay the faint outline of a circular brand, an army insignia. The discovery sent a ripple through him. This horse had once belonged to the cavalry, a creature trained for battle, for thunder and fire. No wonder he stood so still. He'd learned the language of fear and endurance. As the day stretched on, Caleb found himself talking to the horse more than he intended. About the forge, about the fire, about the silence that had followed. The horse never responded, yet something in its quiet listening made the words easier. Each evening, when the sun sank behind the Silvercrest Hills, Ashen would return to the same corner of the yard and would stand motionless, staring into the distance until night swallowed everything. A week passed. Caleb's supplies thinned, his body ached from labor, and still Ashen refused to eat more than a few mouthfuls of grain. The animal seemed to live on air and memory. Once, when Caleb reached out to guide him toward the pasture, the horse froze, ears pricked. Somewhere beyond the ridge came a low, hollow echo. Not thunder, not wind. It lasted only a second, but Ashen answered with a sound Caleb had never heard before. A deep, trembling whinny that carried both longing and warning. The moment passed. The hills fell silent again. Caleb stood with his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the pulse beneath the skin, slow but steady. "You hear something, don't you?" he whispered. "Something calling you out there." Ashen lowered his head, pressing his muzzle lightly against Caleb's shoulder. The touch was brief but certain. An agreement. Maybe even a plea. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Caleb sat by the window of the cabin, the lantern guttering low. The hills were invisible in the darkness, yet he knew exactly where they were. Every instinct told him to stay put, to rebuild, to forget. But another part, the restless, aching part that still searched for meaning after loss, began to wonder what waited beyond those ridges. Just before dawn, when the first pale light crept into the sky, he heard a noise outside. The soft thud of hooves moving away. He stepped out barefoot, breath hanging in the cold air. The barn door swung open. The rope lay slack on the ground. Ashen was gone. Far off, through the mist, Caleb caught a glimpse of movement on the slope. A ghost-gray shape, climbing toward the hills. He stood there, torn between anger and awe, the fog curling around his boots. The first sunbeam broke through the clouds, lighting the ridge in a wash of silver. He exhaled slowly. "All right then," he said into the wind. If you're going somewhere, I guess I'm following." He grabbed his coat and started walking after the fading tracks, the fog swallowing them both. The trail to the Silver Crest Hills was quiet, except for the soft thud of Caleb's boots against the frost-hardened earth. The fog had lifted, leaving behind a world bleached of color, sky the color of tin, grass brittle as paper, and the air so thin it whistled through the gaps of his coat. He followed the hoof prints winding north, faint in some places, deep in others, as if Ashen had alternated between exhaustion and certainty. By mid-morning, he reached the base of the hills. The landscape shifted from open prairie to broken stone, gray shale crunching beneath his steps. Every sound echoed here. The scrape of rock, the rustle of his coat, even his breathing seemed to come back to him from some distance away. Somewhere higher up, a hawk circled, its cry cutting through the silence like a blade. He found Ashen standing on a narrow ledge that overlooked the valley below. The horse's head was lifted for the first time since the auction, his mane tossing in the wind. For a moment, Caleb didn't move. There was something sacred about the sight. A creature that had once been broken, now standing against the sky, as if remembering who it had been. Caleb climbed the last few feet and stopped a few yards away. "You ran off just to stand here?" he said softly. "Scared me half to death." Ashen turned his head slightly, one dark eye catching the light. It wasn't defiance Caleb saw there, but patience, as if the horse had been waiting for him to arrive. He took a slow step forward. The air carried a faint, metallic tang, sharp and cold, like iron struck under snow. The smell reminded him of his forge, of the days when heat and hammer had made sense of the world. He knelt beside a patch of disturbed soil where Ashen had been pawing at the ground. Beneath the loose gravel, something glinted. A small ring of rusted iron, half buried, half forgotten. Caleb brushed the dirt away and pulled it free. It was an old military bridle clasp, its surface engraved with a faint mark. U.S. Cavalry. He sat back on his heels, staring at the piece in his palm. "So that's it," he murmured. "You came from here." Ashen snorted, the sound deep and low, and turned toward a narrow cut between the rocks. Caleb followed the horse's gaze and saw a faint line of wooden posts, remnants of a fence long rotted away, leading into the cleft. He hesitated. The entrance looked unnatural, almost hidden by the years, and beyond it lay only shadow. "Whatever you're looking for," he said, "I don't reckon it's waiting for either of us." But Ashen stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat inside the stone. Caleb cursed softly, slung his coat tighter, and followed. Inside, the air cooled. The walls rose close on both sides, streaked with veins of quartz that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. The path bent once, then opened into a hollow half swallowed by grass and dust. The remains of a small camp lay there, a rusted lantern, the skeleton of a wagon, and scattered nails blackened with age. Caleb knelt, fingertips brushing the brittle handle of a canteen. The initials etched into the metal read J.K. He froze. That name, Jonah Ketter, was one he'd heard before, years ago, whispered among blacksmiths who forged for the army. Ketter had been an officer, rumored to have gone missing during a silver expedition. Men said he'd taken the mine's profits for himself and vanished into the hills with his horse and crew. None had come back. Caleb glanced at Ashen. "Was he your rider?" The horse shifted uneasily, tail flicking. Then, as if answering, he stamped the ground once, a single, decisive sound that sent a puff of dust swirling through the still air. A shiver traced Caleb's spine. The hollow seemed to hold its breath. From somewhere deep within the ridge came a low, hollow groan, the kind mountains make when wind slips through cracks unseen. But the air was still. The sound repeated, closer this time, like a whisper inside the rock. Caleb stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "We should head back before—" He stopped. Beneath his boot, something clicked. The ground shifted slightly, then settled. He crouched and brushed aside a layer of stones, revealing a square of weathered timber fitted into the earth. It was a door, reinforced with iron bands, edges lined with the same dust that coated everything here. The echoing noise came again, faint but rhythmic, not wind this time, but the steady drip of water far below. Ashen stepped closer, nostrils flaring. His ears twitched toward the sound, and his tail swept low, slow, and deliberate, not fear, but recognition. Caleb rested his palm against the wood. It was cold, older than he could guess. "You really did bring me here on purpose, didn't you?" he whispered. He pulled gently on the handle. It didn't move. Rust groaned beneath his grip. He tried again, harder, until the hinge gave a reluctant sigh and the door lifted, sending a wave of stale air against his face. The smell was a mix of earth, stone, and something else. A sweetness gone sour with time. Below him yawned a black tunnel, lined with wooden supports and old rail tracks leading into darkness. A shiver of light glimmered off the damp rock. Silver, maybe, or water, he couldn't tell. He looked back at Ashen. The horse had stepped to the edge, peering down with one clear eye. For the first time, Caleb saw something alive in that gaze. Memory, maybe even sorrow. "You know what's down there," Caleb said, "and you still want me to follow." The horse lowered his head slightly, like a nod. Caleb hesitated. He'd come all this way with no plan but curiosity. Now he stood on the edge of something that smelled like fate. His whole life had been one long turning away, from the fire, from people, from God. Maybe this was his chance to turn toward something again. "All right," he said quietly. "Lead the way." He stepped onto the first rung of the ladder, its wood damp and soft under his boots. The dark swallowed him as he descended, the faint echo of dripping water marking time like a distant clock. Above, Ashen waited, a silent sentinel against the gray light. The hills held their breath once more, listening as man and horse crossed the invisible line between what was lost and what was waiting to be found. When Caleb climbed back into daylight, the sun had dipped behind the ridges, bleeding the sky into amber and gray. His hands were black with dirt, his nails packed with the soil of decades. Behind him, the wooden door he'd unearthed sat half open like a wound in the earth. The smell of old air and rust clung to him. Ashen stood nearby, still as a monument, mane stirring in the wind. For the first time, since he'd bought the horse, Caleb felt the shape of purpose rising in his chest, faint, uncertain, but alive. He brushed his palms on his coat and looked toward the valley. "You found something down there," he said to the horse. "Or maybe you remembered." Ashen flicked an ear, then turned his head toward the west, toward the faint ribbon of trail that wound higher into the mountains. The light caught his eye, and Caleb swore he saw it glimmer like molten silver. The horse snorted once, as if impatient, and took a single step toward the path. "No," Caleb muttered, half to himself. "We've gone far enough." He tugged the lead rope gently, expecting resistance, but Ashen didn't move. The rope grew taut. Then, with a quiet certainty that unnerved him, the horse began to walk the other way, pulling Caleb toward the narrow pass. "Damn stubborn creature," he whispered. But he followed. The climb was slow. The path cut through switchbacks lined with sagebrush and the bleached bones of fallen trees. Now and then, the wind carried the faint chime of metal, rocks striking one another somewhere unseen, like echoes of a distant forge. Caleb's heart thudded in rhythm with Ashen's hooves. Every few yards he caught flashes of something under the dust. Rusted tools, scraps of leather, fragments of wood. Traces of men who'd come before and never returned. The trail widened at last into a plateau scattered with boulders. Ashen stopped in the center, lowered his head, and began pawing at the ground again. Caleb sighed, kneeling to see what drew the animal's attention. Beneath a thin crust of dirt lay a small wooden cross, the letters carved so shallow they were nearly erased by time. J.M. 1864. Caleb sat back, wind tearing through his hair. "You brought me to a grave." The horse stood quiet beside him, eyes fixed on the western horizon where the light was fading. Caleb bowed his head. The letters on the cross meant nothing to him, but the silence around them did. It was the kind of silence that held memory. Heavy, unrelenting, the sort that pressed into your chest until you forgot to breathe. He stayed there until the last light drained from the sky. When he finally rose, the temperature had dropped. Frost glimmered along the stones. Ashen nudged his shoulder gently, urging him on. Caleb followed the horse's gaze again. Further up the ridge, the land sloped toward a hidden valley. He could make out faint lines carved into the hillsides, too even to be natural. He realized what they were: abandoned mine shafts. The wind carried the smell of rain, mixed with the same metallic tang he'd noticed before. He thought of the iron clasp, of the door beneath the earth, of the initials on the cross. A picture began to form. A line of soldiers, a storm, greed and betrayal buried under rock. As night descended, they started back down the trail. The moon rose behind them, turning the landscape pale and unreal. Caleb could see his breath, each cloud of it fading into the dark. Ashen walked close, steps sure despite the rough terrain. Once, when Caleb stumbled, the horse stopped instantly, steadying him with the bulk of his body. The gesture startled him more than the near fall. "You're protecting me now?" he said with a tired smile. The horse flicked his tail and moved on, unbothered. They reached the base of the ridge just as thunder rolled over the plains. A storm was brewing, its light flashing against the distant hills. Caleb looked back once, the faint outline of the plateau barely visible under the storm's edge, and then turned toward home. By the time they reached the valley floor, the rain had begun. It wasn't heavy, just a steady drizzle that darkened the soil and slicked their hair. The smell of wet earth rose thick and raw. Caleb guided Ashen toward the narrow road leading to his farm, but the horse balked again, pulling sideways. The rope slipped through Caleb's hands, burning his skin. "Enough," he snapped. But the animal planted his hooves and refused to move forward. Lightning flashed, revealing the direction of Ashen's gaze, not the road, not the farm, but the shadowed expanse of hills they'd just left. For a moment, Caleb saw something in that look. A grief that wasn't human, but felt like it. As if the horse knew that whatever rested in those hills wasn't done with them yet. He gave up trying to lead. Instead, he stood beside the animal, shoulder to shoulder, letting the rain wash over both of them. The wind howled through the grass. The thunder rolled again. Caleb tilted his face to the sky and whispered, "All right. Not tonight. We'll wait." When they reached the barn, Ashen walked in without coaxing. The horse stopped at the back wall, head lifted toward the hills, water dripping from his mane. Caleb unbuckled the reins and set them aside. The storm rattled the roof. Every flash of lightning threw their shadows huge and ghost-like across the walls. "You came back from that place once," he said, leaning on the stall door. "Guess I did too." Ashen breathed softly, then turned his head toward Caleb. For an instant, lightning lit both their faces, man and beast scarred by different fires, bound now by something neither could name. The storm passed slowly, leaving the air heavy and clean. When Caleb finally lay down on the cot near the forge, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the echoes under the mountain, the glint of silver in the walls, the cross carved by hands long gone. He understood one thing with absolute certainty. The horse hadn't led him astray. Not once. Outside, Ashen shifted in his stall, restless. His hoof struck the dirt in a slow rhythm, like the beat of a distant drum. Caleb listened until his eyes closed, that sound carrying him into uneasy dreams filled with silver light and voices buried under stone. When dawn came, the valley shimmered beneath a thin veil of mist. Ashen stood waiting at the gate, reins hanging loose, looking toward the hills again. Caleb walked out, coat buttoned, hat low against the morning chill. He stopped beside the horse and placed a hand on its neck. The skin was warm, trembling with restrained energy. "I guess it's your road now," he said quietly. "Lead on." Together, they turned toward the path that rose between the hills, the world still wet and shining behind them. By the third morning, frost silvered the fence posts, and the breath from both man and horse rose like smoke in the cold. Caleb woke before dawn, drawn outside by a stillness that felt unnatural. The valley held its breath, as if waiting. Ashen stood already saddled near the barn gate, hooves planted, gaze fixed once more toward the Silver Crest Hills. Caleb didn't need to speak. Something in him had surrendered to the inevitable. He fastened his coat, took a last look at the ruins of his forge, and whispered to the wind, "All right, let's finish what you started." They climbed higher than before. The air grew thin and sharp, each gust carrying the scent of pine and the faint electric tang of metal. The path wound between ridges scarred by time, abandoned mine shafts, collapsed supports, the bones of an era picked clean. When the sun rose, it poured through cracks in the cliffs, scattering light that shimmered like molten silver across the rocks. It made the ground seem alive, shifting and breathing beneath their feet. By noon, they reached the hollow Caleb had found earlier, where the wooden door lay half open under a skin of frost. Ashen stopped at its edge, ears twitching. Caleb dropped to one knee, brushing snow from the frame. The hinges had frozen again, but the iron felt solid beneath his touch. He could hear the faint echo of water dripping inside. Steady, patient, the sound of time itself counting down. He lit a lantern and descended. The tunnel was colder than before, the air thick with dust that sparkled in the lamplight. The deeper he went, the stronger the metallic scent became. The walls were streaked with veins of silver, real and unmistakable, gleaming through the stone like veins of lightning trapped in rock. Caleb stopped, holding the flame close, awe pressing the air from his lungs. "You really did find it," he whispered. Footprints marred the dust along the track. Old, but not ancient, recent enough that they still held shape. They weren't his, and they weren't horse prints either. His pulse quickened. "Someone's been here," he said aloud, the sound echoing off the stone like a question. He followed the prints deeper, until the tunnel widened into a chamber supported by thick timber beams. The wood had darkened with age, but one beam still bore faint carvings. Caleb held the light close and read, "J.K., 1864, buried for those who cannot be forgiven." His throat tightened. He remembered the initials on the canteen from the hollow. Jonah Ketter, the missing officer. The connection hit him like a blow. This was Ketter's hiding place, the end of a story that had vanished from history. Something caught his eye in the dirt. A box, half buried and rusted nearly through. He pulled it free, wiped the grime away, and pried the lid open. Inside lay stacks of folded parchment, brittle with age. The ink had bled in places, but the first page still bore words that leapt at him even through the centuries. "We took what wasn't ours. God forgive us for what we buried here." Caleb's hand trembled as he turned the page. The letter described a storm, an ambush, soldiers turning on one another over silver they were ordered to guard. Ketter had sealed the mine, trapping both treasure and truth underground. The last line read, "If anyone finds this place, tell no one. Some riches belong to the earth." He sat in silence, the paper trembling between his fingers. The lamplight flickered, throwing shadows across the silver veins. He thought of Ashen waiting above, the horse that refused to leave, the creature branded by war and burdened by memory. Maybe the animal had been there when the soldiers fell, had seen the greed, the fire, the end. Maybe it had wandered ever since, trying to bring someone honest enough to listen. Caleb replaced the papers and sealed the box again. "You did right," he murmured to the ghosts. "And so will I." He started back up the ladder, his lantern casting circles of gold on the walls. When he emerged into daylight, the snow had thickened, falling in lazy spirals. Ashen waited exactly where he'd left him, frost catching on his lashes like tiny diamonds. Caleb set the box down and leaned against the horse's shoulder, breathing hard. "It's all still down there," he said. "Silver enough to buy a kingdom, maybe. But that's not what you wanted me to see, was it?" Ashen exhaled softly, steam curling from his nostrils. The sound was almost human, resigned, tender. Caleb's fingers brushed the coarse mane, tracing the ridges of old scars. "You came back here for something else. Someone else." A shape moved on the ridge above them. Caleb froze, squinting through the snow. 3 riders stood outlined against the sky, their silhouettes dark and motionless. When one lifted a spyglass to his eye, light flashed briefly off the lens. Caleb felt the prickle of danger crawl up his spine. "We've been seen," he whispered. He kicked snow over the trap door and grabbed the box. Ashen tossed his head, uneasy, the whites of his eyes showing. The riders didn't move, but Caleb knew they would. Men like that didn't ride the hills for scenery. They started down the trail, fast but quiet, snow muffling their steps. The storm thickened, erasing the path behind them. Caleb's breath came in harsh bursts, the weight of the box heavy against his chest. Halfway down the slope, a gunshot cracked the air, distant, but close enough to make the horse rear. Caleb ducked low, whispering, "Easy, boy, easy." Another shot. A bullet struck rock near his feet, spraying shards. He looked back. The riders were descending, dark shapes weaving through the storm. "Go!" he shouted. Ashen bolted forward, hooves churning snow into clouds. They raced through the narrow pass, the wind howling around them. The storm hid them as well as it hindered, blurring distance into gray chaos. Caleb clung to the horse's neck, the box pressed tight against him. Each stride thundered through his bones until finally the slope leveled, and the valley spread before them again, white and endless. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the farm, where the ruined forge waited like a scar. Caleb slid off, legs shaking. He buried the box beneath the floorboards, covering it with soot and shards of broken iron. When he looked up, Ashen stood in the doorway, sides heaving, steam rising from his coat. The horse's gaze fixed on him, steady, knowing. Caleb managed a thin smile. "Guess the earth remembers, huh? We just stirred up what it meant to keep." Thunder rumbled faintly over the hills. The riders would come again, of that he was sure. But tonight the wind had shifted. It smelled not of fear, but of silver and rain and something like forgiveness. He reached out and touched Ashen's muzzle. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together," he said. Outside, the snow fell heavier, erasing their footprints one by one, as if the land itself wished to hide them. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a thin crust of ice on the valley grass. The forge sat half buried in frost, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Caleb hadn't slept. The box from the mine lay hidden beneath the floorboards, its weight heavy in his thoughts. He sat by the window with a cup of bitter coffee gone cold, watching the hills where 3 riders had stood the night before. The horizon was clear now, blue and endless, but he could feel their eyes on him still. Ashen stood outside the barn, quiet and alert. Steam rose from his nostrils in thin ribbons. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head toward the hills, ears pricking as if listening to something far away. Caleb envied the horse's calm. He felt hunted already. He knew men who could smell opportunity the way wolves smelled blood. Word would spread about the storm, about the mine, about him. He went to the barn to check the feed, pretending the act meant normalcy. The boards creaked beneath his boots, echoing in the emptiness. Ashen shifted when he entered, turning his good eye toward him. The stall smelled of hay and iron, the faint scent of burned wood still clinging from the forge ruins. "You remember them, don't you?" Caleb asked softly. "Those soldiers, the noise, the fire." Ashen didn't move, but something in the air changed, as if the animal's silence was an answer. Caleb ran his hand along the horse's neck, tracing the old scar that curved down to its chest. The shape of it was deliberate, too precise to be an accident. A mark of ownership. He thought again of Jonah Ketter, the officer whose initials he'd seen carved into the beam. The brand was military, but older, deeper. He wondered if Keter himself had pressed the iron to this creature's skin. That night Caleb dreamed of thunder, but it wasn't thunder. It was hooves, dozens of them, pounding the earth above an underground river of silver. In the dream, the horses screamed, and fire swallowed the hills. He woke with his heart racing, the sound still echoing in his skull. Outside, a figure was standing near the barn. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door and stepped into the cold. The dawn was still gray, the air sharp enough to cut. The man by the barn turned slowly, revealing a face drawn tight from the wind. His hat brim was slick with frost, and his eyes carried the calm of someone used to violence. "Morning," the stranger said. His voice had a measured politeness that didn't match the pistol on his hip. "Name's Jonas Keter." Caleb froze. "That name belongs to a grave up there." Jonas smiled without warmth. "Graves are for men who stay dead." He took a step closer, boots crunching on frost. "You found my property, Mr. Rowan. The mine, the box, the silver. I appreciate you keeping it safe for me." Caleb said nothing. His fingers tightened on the rifle stock. Jonas sighed. "No need for heroics. The claim's older than both of us. I buried that mine when the war ended. I'd planned to come back sooner, but time's got a way of changing a man's luck." He gestured toward the barn. "That horse, Ashen, you call him. He was mine once. Best damn mount in the regiment. Loyal, smarter than half the men. But he ran when the shots started. I thought he died in the fire." Ashen snorted, stepping forward. His muscles tensed, ears flat. The sound that left his throat wasn't fear. It was fury, deep and resonant. Jonas's hand twitched near his gun. "Easy, boy," he said, though his tone held no affection. "We've both seen enough ghosts, haven't we?" Caleb's voice came low. "You branded him. You left him there." "I did what I had to," Jonas replied. "You think the army would have let me walk away with what I found? That silver's worth more than half this county. Men died for it. Men like me." Caleb raised the rifle slightly. "Men like you kill for it." For a long moment, neither moved. The cold tightened the air between them. Then Jonas smiled again, a small, tired smile that looked more like a scar than an expression. "You're not a killer, Rowan. I can see that. But I am, and I'll be back with others." He turned and walked away, his boots leaving shallow prints in the frost. When the wind picked up again, those prints vanished one by one. Caleb stood motionless until the horizon swallowed the man. Only then did he lower the rifle. His breath came, out in a white plume. "So it begins," he whispered. He went back inside and began to move methodically, checking the door locks, patching cracks, sorting ammunition he hadn't touched in years. Ashen watched him through the open stall door, shifting his weight, impatient. "I know," Caleb said. "We can't outrun this, can we?" He spent the day preparing, hiding the box deeper under the floor, filling the trough, setting lanterns by the windows. When dusk came, a thick fog rolled in, muting every sound. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked the silence, then another. They were testing the valley's echo, finding range. Ashen began to pace, hooves drumming against the packed earth. Caleb opened the stall gate and let the horse out. "Stay close," he said. The night fell heavy. The fog turned the world to smoke. Caleb stood in the doorway of the barn, rifle ready, eyes straining against the dark. Then, faintly, he heard it, the same rhythmic pounding from his dream, the sound of hooves. Not Ashen's, but many. Riders. Shapes emerged from the mist. 3, maybe 4, torches flickering like fireflies. Jonas was at the front. "Give me what's mine," his voice called through the fog. "And maybe you keep what's yours." Caleb didn't answer. He backed into the barn, heart thundering. Ashen moved to his side, muscles coiled. The horse's breath steamed like smoke from a furnace. When the first torch came into view, Caleb saw Jonas raise his pistol. Ashen struck first. The horse reared, a sound tearing from his throat that split the fog like thunder. Caleb fired, the shot roaring through the night. The men scattered, shouting. One torch hit the ground, sputtering in the wet grass. Another went out as a rider fell. Caleb ducked behind the barn wall, reloading. Ashen charged again, hooves pounding, driving the remaining men back toward the ridge. In the chaos, Jonas fired once, the muzzle flash flaring like lightning. Caleb heard the bullet whistle past his ear. Then silence, just the hiss of dying torches and the sharp scent of gunpowder. When the fog cleared, the riders were gone. The ground was scarred with hoofprints, the barn door splintered from stray bullets. Ashen stood trembling, chest heaving, a thin line of blood tracing his shoulder. Caleb ran to him, pressing his palm to the wound. "You're all right," he whispered. "You're all right." The horse nickered softly, head lowering until their foreheads nearly touched. Caleb could feel the heat of his breath, the steady rhythm of life beneath battered skin. Outside, the wind changed direction, sweeping the valley clean. The hills stood black against the stars. Silent once more. Caleb looked toward them and felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. The ghosts were awake now, and none of them were finished. The first smoke appeared at dusk, a thin gray ribbon rising from the far side of the valley. Caleb saw it from the barn door, where he'd been sharpening a hoe blade just to keep his hands busy. The day had been unusually still. No wind, no birds. Even the creek behind the house had fallen silent, as if holding its breath. When that ribbon of smoke began to climb, it looked almost innocent, like someone burning brush after harvest. But then came another column, darker, thicker, and he knew. He dropped the blade and ran toward the house. Inside, the air felt wrong, heavy with the copper scent of fear. Ashen stood tethered by the water trough, head high, ears twitching. The horse made a low, warning sound deep in his chest, one Caleb had never heard before. Not fear, not panic, but fury. The first gunshot cracked across the valley. A window pane burst beside Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. He ducked low, heart pounding. The riders had returned. Jonas was making good on his promise. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered as he untied Ashen's rope. "We're not dying in this dust." He grabbed the rifle from the wall and checked the chamber. 6 bullets. Not nearly enough. The barn door shuddered under the impact of another shot. Voices followed, rough, confident, closing in. He recognized one. Jonas Ketter, calm even in violence. "Rowan," the man shouted. "You had your chance. Hand it over and you walk away." Caleb didn't answer. He peeked through the gap between boards. 5 men this time. They fanned out across the yard, torches in hand. Their horses stamped restlessly, silhouettes haloed in firelight. Jonas rode in front, face pale beneath his hat brim, eyes shining like coins in the dark. "Burn it if you have to," Jonas said. "The mine dies with him." The torches flew. Flames licked the barn wall, caught the hay, and spread fast. Heat slammed into Caleb's face. He stumbled back, coughing. Ashen reared, striking the air, hooves flashing like sparks. Without thinking, Caleb cut the stall rope and shouted, "Go!" But the horse didn't run. Instead, Ashen bolted toward the open doorway, straight at the men outside. The stall door exploded off its hinges as the animal burst through the fire. Jonas's men yelled, scattering, one of them dropping his torch. Ashen's body gleamed orange in the firelight, a living ember against the smoke. Caleb saw him lash out with his hind legs, heard the sickening crack of bone as one attacker went down. "Shoot it!" someone screamed. A pistol fired, the bullet whistling through the air. Caleb didn't see where it hit, only that Ashen stumbled, caught himself, and kept moving. Then Caleb was running too, through the smoke and cinders, rifle blazing. He dropped one man near the fence, another by the well. His lungs burned, eyes stinging, but he didn't stop until he reached the horse. Ashen was circling Jonas now, breath coming in hard gasps, steam mixing with smoke. The man backed up, pistol raised. Caleb saw him hesitate, just enough, and fired. The shot tore through Jonas's hat, grazing his temple. The man fell backward into the mud, stunned. Caleb grabbed Ashen's bridle, pulling him away from the blaze. "Come on, we're done here." The horse resisted for an instant, then relented, limping but alive. They stumbled down the slope behind the forge, where the creek ran shallow and black. Caleb splashed water over the horse's shoulder, over his own face, anything to cool the fire clinging to them. Behind them, the barn collapsed. The roof went first, then the support beams, sparks shooting into the night like dying stars. The smell of burning oak and tar filled the air. Caleb leaned against the horse's neck, trembling. "It's gone," he whispered. "Everything again." Ashen turned his head, pressing his muzzle to Caleb's chest. The contact was gentle, grounding. In that small, wordless gesture, the man found enough strength to stand. He looked back toward the ridge. Jonas was gone, disappeared into the smoke or crawled away into the darkness. It didn't matter. He'd be back. They stayed by the creek until the fire died to embers. When dawn came, Red Willow was a scar of ash and silence. The forge, the barn, the last remnants of his old life. All gone. But the mine still waited beneath the hills, and the papers beneath his floor were safe, hidden under the one place no flame could reach. Caleb wrapped Ashen's shoulder with strips torn from his coat. The wound was shallow, but the horse flinched each time the cloth tightened. "You're tougher than me," Caleb said quietly. "Always were." They rested until the sun climbed high enough to melt the frost. When Caleb stood again, the world smelled of smoke and rain, two scents that would forever mean rebirth to him. He looked toward the east, where the courthouse lay beyond the low ridge. If Jonas wanted to bury him in ashes, then the only answer was paper and law. Ashen shifted, sensing his thought. Caleb patted the horse's neck. "Yeah," he said. "We'll claim it. Not for the silver, but for truth." The road to town was long, but the two figures, one limping man, one wounded horse, cut through the valley like survivors walking out of a battlefield. Behind them, the land still smoldered. Ahead, the air shimmered with the faint promise of justice. When they reached the ridge, Caleb turned one last time. The ruins of his home glowed faintly in the sun, black smoke trailing upward like prayer. He tipped his hat. "Guess that's the last fire you'll take from me," he said softly. Ashen whinnied once, a low, broken sound that echoed off the hills. Together, they started down the other side, toward Red Willow's small courthouse and whatever waited beyond it. The morning after the fire, the world seemed too quiet. The air still smelled faintly of smoke, but the valley had settled into that strange stillness that comes after destruction, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Caleb stood at the edge of what had been his forge, boots sinking in the damp ash. Nothing remained but twisted iron and a few blackened stones. He picked one up, turning it in his hand. The surface was warm, smooth, almost polished, as if the fire had burned away everything that wasn't meant to last. Ashen stood nearby, one shoulder wrapped in cloth, steam rising from his body in the cold light. The horse's eyes were clearer this morning, reflecting the pale gold of dawn. He looked toward the hills again, but this time his stance was different, not yearning, not warning, but something like patience. Waiting. Caleb brushed soot from his coat, straightened, and said, "All right, partner. If they want to steal the ground out from under us, we'll make sure the law knows it's ours first." The road to Red Willow stretched flat and long, lined with brittle weeds that whispered under the wind. Caleb walked beside Ashen, his steps uneven but steady. The horse's limp was faint, more pride than pain. Together they made their slow way toward the town, a pair of silhouettes crossing the wide Montana plain. By midday, they reached the outskirts, a handful of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the horizon, smoke curling from chimneys like thin prayers. The courthouse stood at the center, its white paint peeling, the flag above it faded to a ghost of red and blue. A few townsfolk turned to stare as Caleb approached. His face was blackened, his coat burned at the hem, and beside him walked a scarred horse that looked like it had survived a war. Inside, the courthouse smelled of ink and dust. The clerk, a round man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from a ledger. "You look like trouble," he said dryly. "Not trouble," Caleb replied, placing a hand on the counter. "Just a man filing what's his." The clerk squinted. "And what's that?" Caleb set down a folded piece of parchment. "A mining claim, Silvercrest Hills, 40 acres. The clerk blinked, then chuckled. "That place again? Folks have been chasing ghosts up there since before my father was born. You sure you want to waste your last nickel on superstition?" "I'm sure," Caleb said. He reached into his pocket and laid 5 silver coins on the counter. Real silver, polished bright despite the soot on his hands. The clerk stopped laughing. He picked up one of the coins, weighing it between his fingers, testing the edge with a practiced thumb. "Where'd you come by this?" "Found it in the earth," Caleb said simply. The man hesitated, then nodded. "All right, paperwork's $5. Caleb paid, signed his name with a slow, deliberate stroke, and watched as the clerk pressed the official seal into the corner of the document. The sound of the wax stamp echoed softly in the quiet room, a small sound, but one that felt enormous. "Congratulations, Mr. Rowan," the clerk said. "You now own one of the most worthless hills in Montana." Caleb folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Worthless to some," he murmured. When he stepped outside, the sun had shifted west, the light turning the street into gold dust. Ashen waited by the hitching post, his mane stirring in the wind. Caleb reached out to touch his muzzle, but stopped when he noticed 3 figures standing across the street. Jonas Ketter was among them. The man had cleaned himself up, new coat, new hat, but the fresh bandage above his brow told Caleb everything he needed to know about how he'd spent the night. The other 2 men with him were strangers. One tall and thin with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest, the other carrying a satchel of papers. Jonas smiled, though it never reached his eyes. "Morning, Rowan. Busy day at the courthouse?" Caleb's hand brushed the edge of his coat, feeling the paper beneath it. "Just setting things right." "Setting things wrong, more like," Jonas said. "You filed on my land." "Your name wasn't on the claim," Caleb replied. The tall man with the star stepped forward. "Mr. Ketter tells me he's got evidence of ownership. Legal deeds, survey notes, says they went missing during the war. He's here to reclaim them." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And I suppose you're here to make sure the law bends the right way." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "Just doing my job." Ashen stamped the ground once, a low rumble rising from his throat. The sheriff's horse shied, pulling at its reins. Jonas glanced at the animal, something flickering in his face. Not fear exactly, but recognition. "That horse still remembers me," Jonas said quietly. "Maybe I should have branded him deeper." Caleb's voice came out like gravel. "You'll touch him again over my grave." Jonas tipped his hat, the smile returning like a knife. "That can be arranged." He turned and walked away, the 2 men following. Caleb watched until they disappeared around the corner, then exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the sealed paper against his chest, warm through the fabric. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was proof, a promise. He looked up at the sky, where a hawk traced lazy circles. "Guess the living have to fight for what the dead left behind," he said softly. The journey home was slower. The sun bled red over the hills, and the shadows stretched long across the road. When they reached the valley, the ruins of the forge stood waiting, black against the fading light. Caleb slid the document into the tin box beneath the floorboards, the same place where the mine's confession lay. Side by side. Truth and ownership. Sin and justice. Ashen stood outside, watching the sunset. Caleb joined him, resting a hand on the horse's neck. "We did it," he said. "At least on paper." The horse shifted, the muscles beneath his skin rippling like water. His one good eye caught the dying light and turned it to silver. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled. Not the promise of rain, but the sound of hooves. "They'll come again," Caleb whispered. "And next time, they won't be just 3. Ashen lifted his head, ears turning toward the distant hills. For a moment, man and horse stood as one. 2 figures etched against the horizon, guardians of a secret the world wasn't ready to believe. Then, as the last light vanished, they turned back toward the valley, where shadows gathered and tomorrow waited like a blade yet to fall. The night before the storm, the valley was too still. Even the crickets had gone silent. The moon hung low and swollen, bleeding a pale light over the land, turning every shadow into a secret. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by the hearth's cold remains, the mining claim spread open across the table, the edges worn soft from his fingers. That single sheet of paper was proof of everything he and Ashen had survived, and everything that might destroy them still. Ashen shifted outside, his hooves dull against the frozen ground. Through the open window came the faint sound of the horse breathing, steady, patient, like the earth itself refusing to die. It was the only sound Caleb trusted anymore. He looked up when the first gust of wind pushed through the door. It smelled of rain and dust. But beneath that, he caught something else, the faintest trace of smoke. He rose, heart quickening, and stepped outside. To the east, along the ridgeline, a faint flicker of fire blinked and vanished, then blinked again. Signal lamps. Riders. "They're coming, boy," he whispered. Ashen lifted his head, muscles coiling beneath his scarred hide. The horse's ears flicked once, then forward, facing the threat neither of them could yet see. Caleb moved fast, stuffing the claim and Ketter's confession into his coat, tying the corners tight. He loaded the rifle, slung the canteen over his shoulder, and turned to Ashen. "One more run," he said quietly. "After this, we rest." By the time they reached the northern edge of the valley, the wind had risen into a low moan. The land sloped upward into the Silver Crest Hills, where the mine's mouth lay hidden beneath brush and stone. Caleb could see torchlight weaving among the lower trails, Jonas's men sweeping the valley floor. He knew what they wanted: the papers, the silver, the silence of a witness who refused to disappear. Ashen moved with purpose, the limp from his old wound nearly gone. The horse seemed renewed, driven by a strength that came from someplace older than flesh or will. Each breath came out in white bursts. Each stride sent echoes tumbling down the canyon walls. They reached the mouth of the hidden trail just as dawn began to bleed into the sky. The air shimmered faintly with frost, and Caleb could taste the metallic tang of cold stone. Behind them came the unmistakable sound of pursuit, the sharp crack of a whip, the drumming of hooves. "Go!" Caleb shouted. Ashen surged forward, hooves striking sparks off rock. The narrow pass twisted like a snake, hemmed in by cliffs on both sides. Caleb crouched low, his hands tight on the reins. The sound of the pursuers grew louder. 5 riders now, maybe 6. Jonas's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "He's mine. Bring me that bastard alive." The trail opened suddenly into the high plateau where Caleb had found the cross weeks before. The small grave stood in the center, half buried in snow. For a moment, it looked as though the earth itself was glowing beneath the rising sun. Ashen slowed, nostrils flaring. Caleb felt the decision in the horse's body before he understood it in his mind. The animal turned sharply away from the open path and began climbing the steep incline toward the highest ridge. Behind them, gunfire exploded, echoing through the canyons. A bullet tore past Caleb's ear. Another struck the ground near Ashen's foreleg, sending shards of rock flying. "Faster!" Caleb urged, though he could barely breathe. They crested the ridge and stopped. Below, the riders spread out, small figures against the pale valley. Jonas led them, his hat gone, his face hard as iron. The man dismounted, raising his rifle. Caleb looked at the horse beneath him, the scars along its neck, the single good eye gleaming silver in the light. "You don't owe me this," he said. Ashen pawed the ground once, and Caleb realized too late that the horse had already decided. With a sudden cry that echoed like thunder, Ashen reared and charged straight down the slope. The world became motion, snow and stone and light exploding all around them. Bullets whined past, tearing the air. Ashen didn't falter. The horse moved like something born of the storm, every stride defying gravity, every breath pure defiance. Caleb fired twice, dropping 2 riders. The third fired back. The shot struck Ashen high in the shoulder. The horse stumbled, caught itself, and kept going. Jonas turned his rifle toward Caleb, but Ashen veered suddenly, slamming into him with a force that sent both man and beast crashing into the snow. The gun flew from Jonas's hand. Caleb rolled, coughing, reaching for his weapon, but the sound that stopped him wasn't a gunshot. It was Ashen's cry, sharp and raw, the sound of something sacred breaking. The horse had taken the last bullet meant for him. Caleb crawled to where Ashen had fallen. The animal lay on his side, breath shallow, steam curling from his wounds. Blood stained the snow, dark as wine. Caleb dropped to his knees, pressing both hands to the horse's neck. No, stay with me," he whispered. "You carried me this far. Don't leave now." Ashen's eye found him. In that gaze was no fear, no pain, only calm. The horse exhaled one final breath that misted in the cold air, and was gone. Jonas groaned, half buried in snow. Caleb rose slowly, rifle in hand. The two men faced each other, one standing, one on his knees, the weight of their choices between them. "You killed him," Caleb said, voice flat. Jonas spat blood. "You took what was mine." Caleb stepped closer, leveled the rifle, and paused. He thought of the fire, the silver, the graves scattered across these hills. Killing the man wouldn't change any of it. He lowered the gun. "You already buried yourself long ago," he said. Jonas's eyes flickered with something like relief or contempt. Before either could move again, the ridge behind them gave a low, grinding moan. The snowpack above had shifted. The gunfire, the hooves, the weight. It was enough. The slope began to slide. Caleb turned and ran, diving behind a fallen tree as a wall of snow roared down. It swallowed the valley in seconds, erasing men, horses, and the blood that had stained the earth. When the silence returned, the world looked untouched, clean, as if mercy had fallen over everything. He clawed his way free, coughing, half blind. The mine's cross was gone, buried beneath white silence. At the base of the drift, only Ashen's hoofprint remained visible, already filling with snow. Caleb pressed his palm into it, leaving his own mark beside it. "Thank you," he whispered. He stood there for a long time, watching the wind smooth the world back to stillness. Then he turned toward the valley below, where sunlight spilled like molten silver across the land. Ashen had carried him farther than any man ever could, from guilt to grace, from ruin to redemption. And somewhere, in that endless quiet, the sound of a horse's distant gallop faded into the wind. Years slipped by like wind through the wheat fields. The valley healed itself, though it kept its scars beneath the soil. Where the forge once stood, wildflowers grew in the shape of its foundation, blue and gold, bending gently in the Montana breeze. Caleb Rowan lived quietly on that land, older now, slower in movement, but still with that same deliberate grace of a man who had learned to live without hurry. His hair had turned the color of snow, his beard streaked with silver. Time had carved him down to his essence, like the hills stripped bare by rain, leaving behind only what was meant to last. He'd rebuilt, though not the forge. He had no more appetite for fire. Instead, he built fences, tended grass, and gathered the wild horses that wandered the plains. Folks around Red Willow called it the Refuge. The name fit. The animals came starved, limping, blind in one eye or haunted in spirit, and he took them in as if each were an old friend returning home. At dawn and dusk, Caleb could be found by the hill near the creek, sitting beneath a weathered oak. From there, the world spread open. The valley below, the shimmer of morning mist, the faint echo of the Silver Crest Hills in the distance. And halfway up that slope stood a single headstone carved from pale granite, simple words chiseled deep. Ashen. He carried more than a man ever could. Each spring, Caleb polished the stone with the sleeve of his coat. The touch had long since worn smooth the edges of the carving. Sometimes he spoke aloud, sometimes not. There were no prayers, only the rhythm of wind through grass and the quiet clatter of hooves from the pasture below. He remembered every sound of that last ride, every flash of light, every breath. Memory softened with time, but it never dulled. The older he grew, the more he understood what the horse had done, not just saved him, but delivered him to something beyond survival. The mine still lay buried under the hills, sealed by snow and silence. Some said the avalanche had locked away veins of silver rich enough to buy a kingdom. Others said it cursed the land, that the wind still carried the cries of men lost beneath. Caleb never corrected them. He knew what was buried. There wasn't treasure or curse. It was truth. Some things the earth deserved to keep. One autumn afternoon, a rider from the county seat came down the road with a letter in hand. The young man dismounted awkwardly, eyes full of respect for the old ranch and its stories. "Mr. Rowan?" he asked. "It's from the governor's office." Caleb took the envelope, broke the seal, and read slowly. It was an official notice. Recognition of ownership for the Silver Crest claim, its boundaries verified and recorded. A legal stamp of what he had already known in his heart. There was also a note from the clerk in Helena. "Your claim has been the subject of more petitions and legends than any in the state. We thought you should know. It's yours, free and clear." Caleb folded the letter and smiled faintly. "Free and clear," he repeated. Words that once would have meant everything now felt light, almost hollow. He looked toward the hill. "Guess we already knew that, didn't we?" That night the sky opened wide and clear. The stars spilled across it like crushed quartz, bright and sharp enough to hurt the eyes. Caleb sat by the fence, the same rifle across his knees, not for fear, but out of habit. From the barns came the soft sounds of horses shifting, nickering in their sleep. The smell of hay and rain mingled in the cool air. He spoke quietly, his voice carried away by the wind. "You'd like it here now, Ashen. They come broken, just like you did. And somehow they all find a way to run again." A faint breeze moved through the pasture, rustling the grass in waves. Caleb's eyes followed the motion until the whole field seemed to shimmer, every blade catching moonlight until it looked as if the land itself glowed from within. Fields of silver light. The phrase rose unbidden in his mind, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure at the edge of the hill. The outline of a horse, tall and proud, mane lifting in the wind. He didn't blink. He didn't dare. The vision held for a few heartbeats, then dissolved into mist. Still, the peace it left behind was real. He felt it, settle over him like a blanket, warm despite the chill. He closed his eyes and let his memories drift. He remembered the auction yard, the laughter of men who couldn't see what he saw. The first time Ashen looked up, and the promise in that gaze. He thought of all the roads since, the fires, the hills, the storms, and how, in the end, it had never been about silver. It had been about seeing worth where others saw ruin, finding grace in what was broken. When dawn came, the sky blushed pink over the mountains. Caleb rose, joints stiff but spirit steady. He walked up the hill and laid the letter from the governor beneath Ashen's stone. "Paper for the living," he said softly, "but this belongs to the dead." As he turned to leave, a soft gust swept across the ridge, lifting his hat and carrying it a few feet before setting it gently down again. He smiled. "Still bossing me around, huh?" Back at the house, he poured coffee, its steam curling into the light. Outside, the world stirred, horses whinnying, the creek singing faintly through stones, the first gold of morning spilling over the valley. Caleb looked out through the open door and whispered, "You carried me farther than any man ever did." Then he stepped into the sunlight, the grass cool beneath his boots, and the day began, quiet, honest, and endless as the land itself. If this story touched something quiet in you, tell me what part stayed in your heart the longest. I'd love to read your thoughts below. And if you enjoy stories about people and the animals that change their lives, make sure to subscribe. There are more tales waiting on the road ahead.